stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting.
When we share stories, whether in our personal or business lives, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're perceived by the people we're sharing them with. When you're listening to this podcast, I encourage you to listen and consider your own related stories. To listen and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. And think about how you share those stories and the messages they carry for you and for the people who are hearing them.
Well, today's guest for the podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is Rabbi Yonason Goldson. And we connected through LinkedIn, and I watched his TEDx and loved the idea behind his TEDx, which is all about not labeling people. And many of my listeners know that I get kind of hostile when I start hearing labels and generalizations, particularly about generations, but also labels generally. I know that they can be useful, but most of the time they just stop you from having close relationships with people that are different from you. So welcome to the show, Yonason. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Sarah. And your introduction kind of sums it all up in one brief soundbite.
Well, I'm very efficient. Well, I always ask my guests to share a little something about themselves that most people might not know about them. And the reason I do that is because we're going to get into some very personal stories and pivot points in your life, those big things, small things that happen that end up changing the way you see yourself. And I love to give our listeners some context for who you are. So what do you think? Do you have something you can share with us?
It's always trying a little challenging to come up with just the right thing. That's maybe not too personal, but personal enough. And I suppose what still has a certain relevance is that growing up, I was pathologically shy. Without going into too much family history, my mother contracted a rare blood disease when I was 10 years old and almost died. And the term PTSD had not been invented yet, but in hindsight, I think it's pretty clear that's what happened to me. And my mother told me my whole personality changed. I went from being a happy and outgoing little kid to being shy and withdrawn and just deeply introverted. And it took a long time for me to come out. It's really only when I got to college that I started coming out of my shell. In fact, when I was in junior high school, I wanted to do theater. It's kind of interesting. I could perform, but I couldn't interact, which I still suffer from to some degree. If I could get on the stage, I'd be great, but I didn't know exactly where the tryouts were being held, and I was too shy to ask anybody how to find them.
That's ironic.
So I never got my shot, but now I'm a platform speaker. And I shouldn't say now because the speaking industry has come to a halt, but it's still something I struggle with. Just picking up the phone. Email has been a blessing and a curse for me because it makes it very easy not to call people. So I can make excuses not to. And really, when we have these types of things, we really have to confront them.
Right. Otherwise, you start to rely on them as a tool and you don't develop the things that you really need to develop.
Right. It's like going to the gym and only working on some of your muscles. You end up coming out a little bit misshapen after a while.
Right. Oh, that's so funny. My friend Shelley Brown is a mindfulness coach and does some public speaking. She's a rock star mindfulness person. She's amazing. And one of the things she said to me one time was when she was presenting mindfulness to a hospitality group, she said, "You're not going to be magically mindful after this event. It takes more than an hour, more than 4 hours to be a mindful person. It's kind of like expecting to go to the gym and work with a personal trainer once and you're suddenly fit." That's not really how it works. And I guess the same concept applies here. You have to keep practicing.
Yeah, and we all know the phrase, you have to get out of your comfort zone. So why don't we do it? Because it's uncomfortable.
Right. I talk about that a lot in my keynotes and my workshops and with my coaching clients. And I had an interesting conversation with a podcast guest a few months ago about the importance of being inauthentic. Mark Bowden out in Toronto was saying that we've attached this awful judgment to the word authenticity, and it ends up making us stay in our comfort zone because we don't want to appear inauthentic. We don't want to be authenticity shamed.
Yeah, I just actually sent off an article about that. Well, we'll see if it gets published or not. But we're in sort of a strange place, and maybe not a healthy place, when authenticity has become a cliche.
I know. Yeah, but Yonason, so many things go that way. And I think there are ways around those buzzwords. So like the word engagement. Employee engagement was such a big thing. It still is a big thing. But what happens, I think, when we attach something specific to a word or a phrase like authenticity or storytelling, then we end up making it its own thing. We take it out of the context of the broader picture. And it does such a disservice to the word.
Well, this is really the problem with cliches. Cliches become cliches because they're true and because we recognize the truth. But once they become cliches, then we can't use them anymore because they become trite and lacking imagination, and we don't hear them because they're buzzwords.
Right. Well, and even beyond that, we start to ignore them because they're a pinpoint in a much bigger story. So, for instance, employee engagement. You can't have employee engagement as its own thing. You have to develop your leaders. You have to have health insurance. You have to have a product or a service to sell. Employee engagement doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are all those other pieces that combine. You can't just pull out this one piece and say, okay, this is employee engagement. We're going to work on this for a while. And the same thing, I'm just reading a book called Shifting, how school leaders can create a culture of change. And one of the main points is when we pick out one part of education that's not working and say, we're going to fix this today, then we take it out of context of the broader picture of education, and it totally messes with the kids and it totally messes with the teachers. And so the same thing happens with buzzwords, I think.
Yeah, and it is a challenge because you have to identify components and work on them in terms of their individual component parts, but you can't do it in isolation from all the other components and all the other factors. So you're stuck in this difficult situation. It's like a chicken and egg thing. I can't fix the whole because I can't fix the parts, and I can't fix the parts because the whole depends on the parts. So it takes a tremendous amount of creativity and perseverance and ingenuity.
And collaboration.
Absolutely.
I think that's the key right there. And that actually brings us right into kind of what we wanted to talk about for this episode, which we've touched on already so many times, is being able to work with other people, collaborate to solve problems without labeling them, without labeling the person. I mean, you can label the problem, but I want to go back to how you introduced yourself as being painfully shy, between 10 years old and probably about 30. Maybe, well, and you still kind of struggle with it.
Yeah. It's the last place I want to be is a cocktail party.
You're not alone on that. There are a lot of people like that.
Oh yeah, I mean, we joke about it in the speakers industry how many of us are introverts. Put us on a stage in front of 1,000 people, we're fine, but put us in a room with 30 people, and we'll just sort of shrink into the corner.
Yes, I get that. I'm curious. I mean, we could go so many directions with this conversation because childhood trauma is something storytelling can address to a certain extent, and uncovering those internal messages, where they came from through those stories. But what I kind of want to focus on is how you, so I read your biography and I read some of what you did as far as traveling and not growing up in a particularly Jewish environment you grew up as kind of a secular Jew, is that correct?
Very much so, yeah.
Very much secular Jew, and then shifted in your 20s to go to rabbinical school. And that's kind of unusual to go from secular to religious. It's a lot less unusual to go from religious to secular. And one of the things you talked about was traveling. And we talked about active listening when we went back and forth with our emails about you being a guest on my podcast. So given that you were so shy, painfully shy, and then you decided to hitchhike across the country as a painfully shy person, do you think that contributed to your, well, I know it contributed, but how did it contribute to your being able to use that characteristic, that painful shyness, to do what you do now?
I would say that my transformation, or let's say my growth out of some of that shyness, really began when I got to college. It was a new place. Nobody knew me. Nobody had preconceptions about me. It goes back to this idea of labels. There was no one to label me as a certain type of person. I even changed my name just because I wanted to identify as a different person. And in fact, one of the first courses I took was Introduction to Philosophy. And we studied Jean-Paul Sartre, who's not somebody that as an Orthodox Jew I particularly look to as a model, but his one of his famous principles is existence precedes essence. First we are, and then we are what we are. And at that time, as someone who lacked any kind of self-confidence or self-esteem or assertiveness, it was such an empowering message that I can actually define myself and choose to be someone different. And that message at that time, in that place, in those circumstances, helped me to start coming out, if you will.
Right.
But another component to it, which, and I'll try to circle back to come back to your question, but one of the things that attracted me to your podcast in particular is that from the time I was very, very young, I loved stories. I was writing stories when I was 7 years old. And I love listening to stories, reading stories, telling over stories. And I wanted to write. I wanted to be a storyteller. And as I was approaching the end of my college career, and I was going to graduate with a degree in English. Well, what does one do with a degree in English? I wanted to write. I wanted to tell stories, but go to graduate school.
Right.
But I wanted, I didn't really have any stories to tell. I didn't have any great ideas to share with the world that were my own. And I still suffered from this sense of withdrawnness, introversion, shyness. And I felt that what I really needed to do was put myself in a situation of complete unpredictability that would force me. And we were talking about comfort zones. This was about as far out of my comfort zone as I could have gone. To put myself really at the mercy of strangers, to face the unexpected, do something about it. This was 1983 that I started. It wasn't the 70s anymore. People weren't standing by the roadsides in swarms getting picked up by VW buses. It was after after the movement.
Things started getting more suspicious,
and it wasn't the wisest of actions. I wouldn't have recommended it. In fact, one time I remember this so well. I'd gone to NASA in Houston. I'd gone to see the space headquarters there, and I was coming back to the highway, and I was walking down the ramp, and just as I got to the highway, this black Toyota Celica that was in the left-hand lane cuts across all four lanes of traffic, honking its horn. And I'm just sort of wondering, what's this guy up to? And he pulls up a few yards ahead of me, and he jumps out of the car, and he says, "Come on, man. I ain't got all day. Get in the car."
Oh. Did you get in?
I was thinking, I'm not sure I want to get in with this guy.
I wouldn't have gotten in.
Well, there are a few times I didn't, but generally you're happy to get in almost anybody. Anyway, I did get in with him. And he turns to me and he says, "Are you out of your mind? Don't you know how dangerous it is to do what you're doing?" And he's just lecturing me.
What was he like? What can you describe him?
He was great. My biggest regret, it was only he had to turn off. We were only together for about 15 minutes. Really interesting guy.
Was he middle-aged? Was he
No,
older?
he was probably in his 30s.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He was some kind of a businessman. I don't remember what he did. And he was telling me about what he was a black guy, and he was telling me what it was like to be in Texas and have married a white woman. And, all of his liberal-minded friends and family up until that point. And the minute he did that, he says they didn't want to know him anymore. Really, really fascinating fellow, which is really what one of the joys of hitchhiking. It didn't always happen. I can't even say it happened most of the time. And we'll get to that too, is I typically did a lot more talking than listening. But every once in a while, I get picked up by somebody who was really interesting. And that was, that was very much, very valuable.
Yeah. Wow. I don't think that I mentioned this in our pre-conversations, but I hitchhiked through New Zealand by myself in 1989 and early 1990 over New Year's. And I do remember a car full of people pulling over and inviting me in, but when they opened the door, it smelled like pot and they didn't look clean and I didn't know, what they were up to. And I said, "Oh, no, I'm going the other direction. Thanks so much." And I just didn't get in and I walked away. And that was the only time I had that sense, like I shouldn't get into that car. And I don't know what it was, but I didn't get in. But I did have a young couple pick me up on my way back to Christchurch, New Zealand, from the southern part of New Zealand, Queenstown. And they picked me up and they said, "Either you're very brave or you're very stupid, but we're going to help take care of you today." I was 19.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and it's definitely different for a woman than for a man.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
There are three rules of hitchhiking. One is don't hitchhike at night because cars can't see you and you can't see who's in the car.
Right.
Two, always have a plan of where you're going to spend the night so you don't get stranded by the roadside. And three, never get in a car with more than two people because assuming that one of them is driving, you've got even odds against the other one if they turn out to not be very nice. So I was standing, I don't remember exactly where this happened. I think it was in the outskirts of Denver. I was trying to get to the Denver Youth Hostel. And I'd gotten a ride all the way from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Denver. And I was only a few miles away. But it was starting to get dark. Yeah, it was starting to get dark. And I really wanted to get there. I didn't want to spend money on a hotel or motel. And so there I am. It's getting dark. And now, so this is rule number one coming into play.
Right.
Don't hitchhike in the dark, right? And I'm in the middle of nowhere. Right? It's the outskirts of town. There's nothing around there. So I have no idea where I can stay. So that's rule number three is down. And this old beat up sedan pulls up by me and the door opens up and there are these three guys in leather. So now what do? Do I break rule number two?
Which rule do I break right now? Right.
And against my better judgment, I got in with them, and who knows what they were? I mean, were they bikers? Were they a gang? Were they going to a Scorpions concert? And they asked me what I was doing, and I said, "Well, I've got these people that are waiting, to see me." I'll be
right, make up a whole story, right?
They said, "Well, where are you going to stay?" I said, "Well, there's this place," and I got the address. And they said, "Well, we can't take you there because we're on our way to the Scorpions concert, but."
Yay.
But, we know where you need to go, and we'll take you to the bus stop, and they'll tell you the number of bus that you need to get on. I mean, these guys were so nice and so helpful and went out of their way as best they could to make sure I got where I was going. And here again, we come back to this I was going to label them based on their appearance.
Right.
And in fact, they turned out to be completely different from anything I would have expected.
Which I would say is usually the case.
Yes.
It's when I drove a VW Bug when I was in college, which broke down pretty regularly. And I remember I was driving back from a really bad date between Denver and Fort Collins, where I was in school. Mm. And I was in a little skirt and pumps. And luckily it wasn't cold out, but my tire blew out. And I couldn't find my flat jack. I must have taken it out of the car. So I had one of those little blue air jacks that's supposed to work. And I couldn't fit it under the running board of the car in order to use it because the car was too low. So as you can imagine, I did find a street light to slowly pull my car underneath, but it was like midnight. It was dark. And I remember putting my back up against the car and I'm squatting down and trying to lift the running board of the car and push my jack under the car so I could get it under there so I could change my damn tire. And I wanted somebody to stop and help me, and I didn't want somebody to stop and help me. I was in really a bad position, and this is before you had cell phones. I couldn't have called AAA. And so I'm standing there against my car, trying to lift it and kick the stupid blue jack under it so that I could get the car lifted and take off the tire. And I see this big white pimp style car pull up behind my car. And he pulled up in front of my car. And when I stood there, I was on the right side of the car, on the shoulder. And the guy got out of his driver's seat, and I saw his belly and his beard first. And he had all these like Harley Davidson style stickers across the back of this brand new car. And he looked like somebody I was a little worried about stopping. And I had my lug wrench in my hand gripped very tightly at my side so that he could see it. So he would know that I was a little frightened, because I knew that if he knew I was frightened, he would behave differently. And he came around the car. He said, "I can help. What's wrong with your jack?" And I told him what had happened. And he said, "Oh, this is a brand new car. I bet I have one of those cool flat jacks in the back." Opens up the trunk, and I'm like, because he opens up the trunk, standing back and gripping this lug wrench. And he took out this big flat jack that could just slide right under the car. And I told him I had tried to loosen the lug nuts, because you usually loosen them before you lift it up. And I tried to loosen them, but I couldn't get them loose. I said, "So don't lift it yet," because I couldn't get the lug nuts loose. And he goes, "You really know what you're doing." And I said, "I drive a Bug." And he laughed. And it took both of us to get those lug nuts loose. I was literally standing on one foot on the lug wrench while he was pushing on it in order to get them loose. But he was the nicest guy. And once we got the car started, I had to roll it backward to jump start it because the hazards had drained the battery because it was a Bug. But it's a standard, so you can jump start it by quickly pressing the clutch and the gas. So I rolled back and started the car up, and he said, "I'm going to follow you to your exit," even though I was going to get off at Loveland. "But I'm going to follow you to your exit to make sure you get to where you need to be." And he said, "You should probably stop at a gas station and check those lugs and make sure they're tight before you keep driving into town." And I remember watching his car, and he followed me all the way to the exit. And I came off the exit ramp going up, and I turned left across to go to the gas station, and he turned behind me. And then I saw him take the on-ramp back going the other direction. Mm-hmm. And I remember just feeling this sense of, I had this guardian angel watching out for me, because anyone could have stopped to, I'm going to put that in quotes, to help me.
Oh, yeah.
And at 21 years old and tiny, I maybe weighed 100 pounds at that point. I was so grateful. So you're right. Those labels, they're painful, and they really limit our potential to help each other.
Sure. And who knows how many relationships we pass up because we make snap judgments about people based on how they look and how they talk and how they dress and all these other externals. And we don't give ourselves the opportunity to actually discover who they are and how much we might benefit by knowing them.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about that painfully shy time, particularly between 10 and like 18 when you went to college, do you remember any incident specifically where that happened, where you kind of had that sense that you were being judged or that you judged somebody else and you were able to kind of make an adjustment?
During that time, I don't think I had that level of self-awareness. I remember learning this in psychology class that shy people are typically very egocentric because we feel that everybody's watching us and everybody's paying attention and everybody's noticing every little thing we do, when the truth is most people just aren't that interested.
Well, they're busy in their own world.
Well, sure, exactly.
Yeah.
And, so we've got this sort of, our antenna are so hypersensitive that we're expending all this mental energy trying to keep ourselves looking just right and acting just right and not doing anything that's going to bring negative attention to ourselves. And you sure miss a lot of life that way.
You do. But you said you took that philosophy class and you didn't just absorb it. Was it your teacher that really walked you through, or what's the story of that?
I think it was sort of like the perfect storm of circumstances, that I'm in a new place, new people, new situation, new labels, and that was freeing and empowering. And at the same time, I was always a thinker. As a teenager, I read lots of science fiction. I was always imagining possibilities. What is the future going to bring? And so philosophy, I didn't have the self-discipline for serious study of philosophy, but the exposure to the ideas was something that was very intriguing to me.
Was there one particular conversation, or do you remember? The only reason I ask is that I remember I read Atlas Shrugged, and I really related to a very shallow character at that time when I read it at 18 or 19. I read it again at 24, and that character disgusted me. I was far more interested and related to other characters in the story. And I remember reading the book. I remember sitting on campus at Colorado State in Fort Collins in the courtyard with barefoot, a tank top and cutoffs. And I remember reading that book sitting in that courtyard and thinking about the characters. I mean, it's such a vivid memory for me. And it had a big impact on how I carried myself.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing you say, because at different phases of our lives will be profoundly influenced by some voice or some idea that if we get a few years later, it's like,
right.
What was it exactly that I found so compelling? I was a big devotee of Robert A. Heinlein, the science fiction. And he's a militant libertarian, and now I look back and go, sure glad I grew up at some point.
Yeah, I do that with movies that I loved in the 80s, and I'll rewatch them with my young friends that are in their 20s, and I'll be like, I loved this movie when I was your age, and I watch it and go, oh my God, that's horrible.
Yeah, exactly.
What's wrong with me? See, I'm labeling myself.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we do change, and the labels are not useless. They're just a little overly confining. But I think the major influence on me at that point was Socrates. I just love Socrates. His whole approach. I taught high school for 23 years, and I still remember the time a student, and a really bright student, straight A student, she got so frustrated. Why can't you just tell us the answer? Because I'm asking leading questions to get them to figure out that they can figure a lot of this stuff out on their own.
Right.
Because I want to teach them to think. I don't want to teach them to sponge and absorb and regurgitate.
Well, That's actually a really big problem in education that they're
Oh,
finding more and more
yeah.
is students who are so focused on the grades would rather you tell them what to do to get an A.
Yeah. And it's, back then, I mean, I started teaching when 1993. You could get students to think. By the time I stopped teaching 2016, and by then it was so difficult to get teenagers to think. It was very disheartening. I mean, good kids, sweet kids, nice
Right,
kids.
right. Where were you?
Where?
Uh-huh. Physically,
Mostly here in St. Louis. I taught for 1 year in Budapest, Hungary.
Wow,
I taught
cool.
it was interesting. I was 2 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and 20 years in St. Louis here.
Wow.
And because
Go ahead.
I was teaching Jewish studies, so I had a lot of freedom in how I taught. And because every teacher has his own style, but it wasn't like math or English or history where I have a certain basic
Outcomes.
yeah, and foundations that I have to lay. So I was free to be myself and
Well,
teach my
especially
own
because
way.
Jewish studies is all about questions.
Right, yeah. But the way Socrates would lead people in a series of questions, and eventually bring them back to the starting point and show them that they had just contradicted themselves.
Ethics. Yeah, particularly in discussions of ethics.
Yeah, and of course that's why they killed him, because that's really annoying. And 2,000 years ago, that's how you dealt with annoying people. You put them to death.
Yeah, well, people don't like to look silly, and he was embarrassing people.
Yeah, well, I mean,
By
corrupting
making
the
them
youth of
look silly.
Athens by
No.
making them think, right?
God forbid.
Yeah.
Wow. The reason I asked where it was is because I see the different parts of the country and different parts of the world generally. You see different kinds of thoughtfulness and behaviors in students and young adults. And we've been fortunate enough to raise our children here in Montana. And while there are definitely kids that you can't make think, you just can't draw that out of them, I'm finding that at least the kids that I've had experience with here have been curious. And I think that's the difference, is that approaching things with curiosity.
Yeah, and again, from the labels, it's an easy shift into the problems of groupthink.
Yes.
Where your culture or your associations will have certain standards of thought and certain conventions, and if you challenge those, you can be excommunicated, and then you have nowhere to go, and now you're an outcast. And so it's a lot safer to just keep your mouth shut and nod and learn the aphorisms and
repeat it back to them.
Exactly.
Right, exactly. That's a big problem.
Yeah, particularly in politics, but
across the board. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh. I did read your article about teaching in Hungary and how one of the students asked about, did you used to have your ear pierced? And that was part of what intrigued me about having this conversation with you, was how you address your former self in comparison to where you are now. And that story was kind of the perfect example. Can you tell that story so our listeners get the context for that?
Sure. I was, as you said, I was teaching in Hungary, and it was a different type of experience. I mean, you can't imagine a more difficult classroom experience. I could tell you stories for hours, but I'll just give you the broad strokes. Discipline was not something that was understood very well in the culture of that school.
Wow. And it was a Jewish studies school, or?
Well, it was a fascinating situation. It was 1993, and the Iron Curtain had only been down for 4 years.
Oh.
So up until that point, there were no religious schools. Right. And as soon as the Iron Curtain came down, this eccentric Hasidic businessman in Borough Park, who had gotten out of Hungary and with his family in 57 or 56. He decided that he was going to start a Jewish school in Hungary.
Wow.
And they got 400 students their first year.
Wow.
Which is absolutely unheard of.
That's
but
crazy.
All these families that remembered they were Jewish and they wanted their kids to have some awareness of what that was. It also helped that they were teaching English, which was useful at the time. It
Right,
had not been taught under the Iron Curtain, because if you can only speak Hungarian, there aren't too many places you can go.
Right. That definitely limits your exposure to other things.
Yeah, and they gave them 3 meals a day. So there were certain side benefits, but the kids were, some of them spoke English, some of them spoke no English, and it was a pretty challenging situation. So I was trying everything I could think of, and sometimes I just let class devolve into chaos because I had 3 kids that were actually interested in learning something. So I'd let the rest of the class go bounce off the walls. And every once in a while, these kids bouncing off the walls would see, gee, those guys over there look like they're interested in what's going on. We should go find out what's happening. So sometimes it actually worked. But anyway, a kid standing next to me, and he says, Rabbi, and he points to the boy next to him and says, he has a question. He says, oh, really? What's his question? He says, well, I wouldn't ask you this, but he's asking, did you used to have an earring? So I paused for a minute, because here I am, the rabbi, in my suit, my tie, and my beard, and my sort of
looking very official,
religious, proper persona. And it was something that I don't really think about, because in the front of my ear, the hole's pretty much closed up and it's very hard to see. But apparently in the back, it's a little more noticeable. Standing behind me. So I decided that generally honesty is the best way to go. And so I told him, well, when I got to Israel as a young man, and I wasn't religious yet, and I was trying to figure out exactly who I was and what I was going to do. And at some point I started wearing what we call tzitzit, which are fringed threads that are attached to the 4 corners of a special garment. And typically Orthodox men wear them usually underneath our shirts, and sometimes hanging outside over the belt. And the tzitzis, the fringe represents that God created the world unfinished, and that we are here to complete the job and become partners in creation, and therefore partners with God by doing so. I didn't tell him all that at the time, but what I said was I had put these things on and started wearing them, but I hadn't taken out my earring yet that I was wearing while I was traveling. And I was in an elevator. I still remember it was in the King David Hotel. And a secular Israeli middle-aged fellow he got in with me, and he took one look at me and he said, Maza. He says, what's this? Israelis are not shy.
Yeah, no kidding.
About saying what's on their mind.
Right.
And I looked at him, and he points to the tzitzis on my belt, and he points to my earring. He says, you can have this, or you can have this. You can't have both. Now, today, over 30 years later, that's not true. You can find all kinds of mix and match combinations. But
right, but back then it was contradictory.
It was a little less. And he said, I'm sorry, I have to say what I think. I said, well, I've gotten used to that already. But it sort of resonated with me that you can't be everything. You sort of, for all our talk about rejecting labels, we still have to have a sense of self-identity. We have to know who we are. We have to know what we stand for. We have to know what we believe in. And the danger with labels is that it cuts us off from other people, or it allows us to put ourselves in boxes. But it's not, resisting labels is not an excuse to be wishy-washy or flaky or non-committal. I think that we have to be very passionate about what we believe and who we are and what our purpose in life is.
As long as it doesn't bleed into judgment against others.
Well, that's the sages say, and it's in the book Ethics of Fathers, which is really the most famous, preeminent work of Jewish ethics and morals. The first teaching in the book is be deliberate in judgment. Right? It doesn't say don't judge. It says don't rush to judgment, because we need judgments. We need to have things that we believe in. We have to have there have to be values.
We have to know which car not to get into.
We have to have a sense of right and wrong.
Right.
Because otherwise there's chaos and anarchy, which is not freedom. And at the same time, we have to be able to appreciate that other people are coming from other places, and that even if I believe I'm right, I can still accommodate others who believe differently, and I can still find in others value that comes from places where we don't necessarily disagree.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, after that elevator incident, it sort of made me feel that I am going to have to make a commitment at some point.
Yes. Well, in that particular situation, those circumstances, I think it was important for you as an individual, not for external conflict, for some guy to say you can't do both, but internally you had to make that decision so that you would be fully committed, because you can't be a rabbi and not be fully committed. You just, that those two don't go together. It's like being a counselor, mental health professional, and not being fully committed to helping your patients. You have to fully commit if you're going to be relevant.
Yeah, and I've had my share of experiences with people who try to straddle the various fences, and it usually doesn't work very well.
Right. And what I liked about your story in that blog post was that you didn't tell them, yes, I had an earring and I took it out. You told them the story of why you removed it. And I think that offered them, the way that you put it is you let them come to their own conclusions. And what I loved about that was that's exactly what storytelling is about. It's not about the moral of the story is. You don't have to tell people the moral of the story. They find their own meaning in every story. And I had that discussion with our younger son when he was studying for his bar mitzvah. And though we consider ourselves secular Jews, we are traditional. We love the rituals, and we had a beautiful bar mitzvah. But Max was questioning why we were doing it if we were secular. And I said, well, tell me about your Torah portion. And he started talking about what his Torah portion meant. And it was all about the rebellion against Moses and Aaron. And he understood kind of how he could get lessons from that story without believing it happened exactly as it was written. And I explained that any literature has the potential, any story has the potential to bring meaning to something else in your life. So that's what I loved about your story, was that you didn't tell them what to think. You didn't tell them, yes, I used to have an earring and I took it out. You told them a story so that they could be discerning, which I think is a much better word for me than judgment, is I'm discerning.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That helps me develop a sense, or be comfortable with a sense of my own intuition, not trusting somebody for a specific reason. So I think of it more as discerning. But I just really appreciated that story. It was really beautiful.
Well, that's good. As I actually wrote that article, I think about 12 years ago, and I just reposted it a week or two ago.
It's timeless.
So,
it's timeless.
I'm glad it resonated.
It definitely did. And just for our listeners to understand better, a lot of American listeners may not realize that when Yonason was talking about his story in Israel, I just read a statistic that I think it said something like 90% of the Jews in Israel, they consider themselves Jews, consider themselves secular Jews. They don't consider themselves religious Jews. And 90% might be high, But that really is so different from the US, because I think people around here just assume that a Jew is a Jew, which is a religious label. But actually, in Israel, I think the word Jew really represents more of a culture, more of rituals, and probably ancestry, genetics. And I found that really interesting when I read that article, the differences between religious Jews and secular Jews in Israel. And one of my friends grew up on a kibbutz in Israel, and she didn't know the Shabbat prayers that we did when we invited her over for dinner. But she loved celebrating because they celebrated Shabbat. They just didn't say the prayers. They lit candles. They drank wine. They had challah, but they didn't say the prayers because it was a more secular celebration. So does that jive with what you would want to tell American listeners?
I think it's more complicated than that. And certainly over the last, I think those statistics may be outdated, because what's been happening in the last, probably 20, 30 years, the Orthodox population in Israel has gone way up. Or I should say maybe the population rate has gone way up, because the religious tend to have larger families.
Right.
And the secular people all over the world tend to have smaller families.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Jerusalem now is more than 50% Orthodox.
Oh, wow.
The country as a whole, I don't remember the last time I heard the numbers, but I think it's probably somewhere around maybe 20% or maybe a little higher. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is you don't really have a lot of shades. You have shades within Orthodoxy.
Right. But
secular Israelis tend to feel it's kind of an all or nothing thing.
Isn't that fascinating?
Right. And in America, we've got all different kinds of, everything on the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, that's what I tell people. It's a spectrum, just like any other religion.
Yeah.
You have the very religious and the very non-religious.
Conservadox to conservative.
Yeah. Most of us are somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in America, the trend is largely towards secularism. Mm-hmm. And in Israel, the trend is towards religiosity.
That's interesting.
Go ahead. It concerns me a little bit, because the religious, we tend to do a little bit better when we're in the minority, because we feel we have to band together. Mm-hmm. As soon as we start feeling that we've got strength, and this has been the history of the Jewish people for 3,000 years, right? When things are tough, we pull together and we prevail. And when things are good, we start bickering with each other and go to pieces.
That is so funny you say that, because even moving to Montana 21 years ago, there was a small Jewish community in Bozeman, and they got big enough that they split. Once you get to like 20 families, you have differences of opinion. And
sign of a successful congregation is you've had a breakaway.
Exactly. Missoula did that too.
The story about the Jew that's stranded on the desert island, and he's there for 20 years, and when finally the rescue boat comes, and he says, "Well, before you take me, let me show you what I've done while I've been here. I built up the whole island." So he starts taking them around. Says, "This is the town hall, and this is the school, and this is the library, and this is the synagogue, and this is the Department of Public Works, and this is the synagogue." He said, "Wait a second. You said that was a synagogue." He said, "That synagogue, I wouldn't set foot in that synagogue."
We're not unique, though, in that way. Churches do the same thing. Every community does the same thing. They get big enough that there's differences of opinion and there's a split. I think it's a way of developing community, actually, as much as it splits them and fractures them. It develops community based on tribal interests.
Well, and I think it goes back to our starting point of labels.
Right.
There is a benefit to getting along with people who don't see eye to eye with me.
Right.
And figuring out that maybe we've got a lot more in common than we have that divides us, and figuring out how to, is why in relationships do opposites attract? Because I want someone who completes me. I want someone who fills in, right? Whether it's partnerships, marriages, friendships, right? If we're just identical, then you're back to the group think, and when we're stepping on each other's toes, and we've got all the same weaknesses that we had individually. Whereas if we can accommodate one another, and I used to occasionally still do go on Christian radio shows or podcasts. And I like to talk about the common values that we share. And every once in a while, somebody will ask, so why don't Jews believe in Jesus?
That's always an interesting question here in Montana.
Yeah. And while I don't mind discussing it privately, we've got so much in common.
Yeah.
Why do we need to focus, especially in a world that there's so many secular influences that are antagonistic to faith and devotion. Let's look at what we have in common and what we can accomplish together instead of picking on.
That's a beautiful answer. That's a beautiful answer. Well, Yonason, this has been really lovely. A really nice conversation. I've enjoyed hearing your stories about hitchhiking and the people you've met. I love the story about your teaching in Hungary and teaching in St. Louis. Pretty amazing stuff. You've been all over the place. And I just really appreciate your sensibility when it comes to recognizing the complementary strengths of the people around you and the importance of taking that step back and relieving yourself of that judgment so that you can learn from other people. I really appreciate that perspective.
The sages say, who is wise? Somebody who learns from every person. So while there may be people that we can only learn from through counterexample,
yes.
Most people have something positive that they can teach us.
Yeah,
I forget who said it, but someone said, everyone knows something you don't know.
I actually say love is easy, but like is hard. And I've learned a lot from people that I love that I don't like very much. So
it's true.
Even if you're going to learn what not to do, I think it's important to recognize they gave you that lesson and be grateful for it.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much. For our listeners, I will have links to connect with Yonason on LinkedIn, as well as his website link. And maybe he'll share a couple of other links that are interesting that we talked about during this conversation, maybe something to Socrates and Sartre. And we'll see what else we can add to that blog post associated with the podcast. So thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure, Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. If you're planning an event or company retreat and want to bring in a memorable, entertaining, and highly practical speaker as your keynote speaker or workshop facilitator, please visit us at elkinsconsulting.com to learn how we can help and provide a memorable keynote or breakout session. Thank you. I look forward to hearing from you.
How could you tell me that you're going away? Don't say